In a small-town diner, two officers speak loudly, bragging about slamming a teenager and making a woman cry. They don't lower their voices. They never have to. At a nearby booth, an elderly black woman stirs her tea and calmly tells them they should be ashamed. They see only her age, her stillness, her quiet dignity, and mistake it for weakness. What they don't know is that Bernice Lanier, the elderly black woman they tried to humiliate, has spent a lifetime facing worse. And her son isn't just a lawyer. He's the federal hammer already in motion. Their mistake was underestimating her. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The summer heat lay thick and unmoving over the cracked pavement outside Joe's diner, curling up from the road in shimmering waves that made the whole street look like it was trying to disappear. The diner itself, squat and unfussy, stood with the kind of permanence that suggested it had survived more than its share of storms, economic, political, and otherwise. It was the kind of place that didn't change, because the people inside didn't ask it to. Its once white siding had faded to the color of old paper, and the red letters on its sign had long since surrendered to the sun, leaving only a name, not a welcome. Inside, the air was a degree cooler, though not enough to offer real comfort. A sluggish ceiling fan spun overhead with the strained insistence of something that knew it was losing. The scent of hot grease mingled with burnt coffee, soap from the mop bucket, and something fainter but always present, like time itself had seeped into the walls and refused to leave. Bernice Lanier pushed through the door with the quiet authority of someone who had never once in her life needed to announce herself. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle, more ceremonial than functional, and she stepped inside with a pace that was neither slow nor hurried, but simply deliberate. Everything about her, from the sensible shoes to the floral blouse tucked neatly into a pressed gray skirt, suggested a woman raised in a time when presentation wasn't vanity, but armor. She moved toward a window booth, her posture straight, her hat held with care as she settled into the seat. She did not look around. She didn't need to. People noticed her whether she invited them to or not, and she had long since grown accustomed to the way eyes followed her, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with suspicion, rarely with kindness. But she paid them no mind. She placed her bag beside her, unfolded the menu without urgency, and rested her hands in her lap, as if she were waiting for something more than lunch. A waitress offered her a polite smile and poured a glass of water. They exchanged no words. Bernice nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of service, and returned her gaze to the menu, though she already knew what she would order. Behind her, in the booth directly across the narrow aisle, two uniformed officers reclined in their seats, with the practiced ease of men who had never been made to feel unwelcome. Their names were stitched into the badges that glinted faintly under the fluorescent lights: Officer Trent Mallory and Officer Kyle Reddick. Mallory, the larger of the two, leaned back into the corner of the booth with a kind of careless entitlement that couldn't be taught. His voice, brassy and unfiltered, carried across the room not by accident, but by design. "Little punk was mouthing off the second I stepped out the cruiser," he said, pausing to take a sip of iced tea. "Didn't take 2 seconds before I had him face down on the hood. That shut him up fast." Reddick laughed, though the sound came too quickly, too high, like he needed to show he understood the joke, even if it didn't sit quite right. He was leaner, younger, the kind of man who was always watching for approval and quick to follow it. "That's nothing," he replied. "Had this woman last week. Real buttoned up, tight skirt, handbag, all that. Didn't like how I searched her car, so I told her to take her shoes off before I started. She started crying before I even popped the trunk." They both laughed then, the kind of laughter that had no weight, no soul, just sound filling space. Sound meant to reinforce something neither of them would ever say out loud. Around them, the other diners kept their heads down, pretending not to hear, pretending not to mind. That, too, had become a kind of custom. Bernice sat still, hands folded now, the menu untouched on the table. She listened without reacting, allowing the weight of their words to settle fully before she acted. She did not turn immediately, nor did she allow any sign of anger to cross her face. Instead, she breathed in deeply once, let the air sit in her chest, and then turned, not abruptly, but slowly, with the careful precision of someone who had decided long ago that when a line must be drawn, it will be drawn cleanly. Her eyes met Officer Mallory's first. She didn't raise her voice, didn't try to match their volume. Instead, she spoke with that calm, rooted certainty that carries farther than shouting ever could. "You too ought to be ashamed of yourselves," she said, each word weighed, deliberate. "You wear that badge not because you are better, but because someone trusted you to act like it. From what I hear, that trust has been sorely misplaced." The table behind her stilled. Mallory stared at her with the kind of disbelief that comes from living too long without consequence. His smirk faded, replaced not with anger yet, but something closer to confusion, like he wasn't used to someone interrupting the easy rhythm of his day. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His shoulders squared as he stepped toward her booth. Not fast, not aggressive, but with that slow, practiced weight of someone who thought posture alone would be enough to intimidate. Behind him, Reddick shifted in his seat and looked toward the counter, but didn't follow. "Mind your business, ma'am," Mallory said, his tone clipped and hollow. Bernice didn't move. "This is my business," she replied, meeting his eyes without flinching. "When people like you treat cruelty as a joke, it becomes everybody's business." The tension that had begun like a ripple now spread like a crack in glass. Subtle, but unmissable. Mallory's jaw worked as he searched for the next move. His voice hardened. "Let's see some ID." "No?" Her answer was unhurried and firm. "You refusing to identify yourself?" he said, arms crossing now. "I'm sitting in a diner," she said plainly, "drinking water, minding my business, until you opened your mouth." "That's enough," he snapped. "You're trespassing." "I've been coming here for years," she answered, unmoved. "You're not the law in here just because you say you are." Mallory stepped closer, his chest nearly brushing the edge of her table. His voice dipped lower. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Bernice said again, voice even, eyes steady. "I'm making it exactly as hard as it ought to be." The silence that followed Bernice's final refusal was not the silence of uncertainty or hesitation. It was the silence of decision. Officer Trent Mallory's expression darkened not from confusion, but from recognition. This woman wasn't going to back down. Not with tone, not with threats, not with proximity. He'd seen defiance before, though usually from people much younger, with less command in their posture. What unnerved him now, though he would never admit it aloud, was how calm she remained, how unshaken. That calm stripped him of the upper hand. He reached out abruptly, seizing Bernice by the forearm with a grip meant to drag her from the booth. The movement sent her purse toppling to the floor with a quiet thud and jostled the glass of water, sending a thin stream trickling across the table. Bernice, still seated, did not resist with violence or shout in protest. Instead, she stiffened, letting her body become immovable not through strength, but through sheer resolve. The harder he pulled, the more obvious it became that this wouldn't be a clean scene. Reddick rose now, reluctantly, casting a nervous glance at the other diners. Their faces were frozen in place, some with forks held inches from their mouths, others mid-bite, as if the act of chewing might imply complicity. The air inside the diner was heavy with that particular kind of stillness people adopt when they believe that looking away will shield them from the truth they're witnessing. "I told you to stand up," Mallory growled, his voice low but laced with rising tension. Bernice lifted her chin, eyes fixed forward. "And I told you I'm not afraid of you." It was then that Mallory's restraint slipped completely. He gave her shoulder a rough shove, knocking her sideways into the corner of the booth. The sound of her back striking the wooden panel echoed faintly across the room. A few people gasped. Someone stood and immediately sat back down. Reddick moved forward, fumbling with his cuffs, clearly wishing this could end more cleanly. Behind the counter, Joe stepped out from the kitchen hallway, drying his hands on a bar towel as he approached the booth, with obvious caution but visible concern. His voice, when it came, was firm, though not aggressive. "Hey now," he said, directing the words toward both officers with the familiarity of someone who knew their names, and perhaps once knew them as boys. "She hasn't done a single thing wrong. You both know that." Mallory turned toward him, already half done with the conversation before it began. "Joe, I'd stay behind that counter if I were you." "She's a customer," Joe replied, folding the towel in his hands, not quite backing down but not advancing either. "She comes in here every other week, never so much as raises her voice. This is wrong, Trent." Mallory gave a small, bitter laugh. "You want us to pull your inspection files, Joe? Want me to take a look in your walk-in? See if everything's labeled the way it should be? Would hate for you to get shut down over something avoidable." Joe's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to Bernice, then back to Mallory. Slowly, he stepped away, retreating not out of agreement, but out of bitter understanding. He was being reminded, not for the first time, that some rules only apply to certain people. "Thought so," Mallory said under his breath. With a sudden yank, he pulled Bernice to her feet. She didn't stumble. Her balance was steady. Her hands, when offered for the cuffs, were neither shaking nor clenched. She held them out with a poise that made the gesture feel more like a ceremony than submission. Reddick struggled to fit the cuffs around her wrists. They were too big for her arms too slim, her bones too narrow for standard sizing. He had to loop a second pair through the first to secure them, hands trembling slightly as he clicked them into place. Bernice didn't look at him. She kept her gaze forward, out the window where the summer heat had begun to blur the cars in the lot. They led her through the diner in silence, past the booths and the tables where the same customers now stared at their food, wishing they could unsee what had unfolded. No one moved to help. No one protested. That was how these things happened. Not with shouts, not with force, but with that quiet complicity of 100 eyes turned downward. Outside, the sun was merciless. It beat down on the cracked sidewalk as the door swung open, casting Bernice's shadow long across the diner floor. She stepped into it, like she had walked this road before, like the weight of shame didn't belong to her. They placed her in the back of the cruiser with professional detachment, shutting the door with more force than necessary. The moment it closed, Mallory exhaled like someone who had won something, though even he wasn't sure what. At the station, the transition was swift and mechanical. Paperwork materialized. A holding chair was cleared. Bernice was processed like a misplaced file, quiet, contained, and not worth more than the minimum required attention. They placed her in a gray-walled room with peeling paint and fluorescent lights that hummed just slightly off-pitch. She sat where she was told and watched them work. Mallory was first to the computer, fingers flying over the keyboard as he entered his report. The incident, he claimed, involved a hostile civilian who refused to comply with lawful orders, raised her voice, created a disturbance, and refused to leave the premises when asked. The term aggressive appeared twice. Disturbing the peace appeared 3 times. The story shifted subtly in his version, less about facts and more about implications. Reddick hovered beside him, uncertain, until Mallory leaned over and clicked a few buttons on his body camera's upload interface. A file disappeared. Another one began uploading, this one beginning well after their arrival at the diner. Mallory looked at Reddick sideways. "Don't be stupid," Mallory muttered under his breath as he finished typing. Reddick didn't argue. He offered no defense, no excuse. He simply gave a small, reluctant nod that might have meant agreement, or maybe just resignation, and turned away from the desk, shoving both hands into his pockets with the uneasy gait of someone who'd just stepped too close to a fire he could no longer pretend wasn't burning. At the far end of the room, Sergeant Doyle Murchison appeared from his office doorway, balancing a half-full coffee cup in one hand and a folder in the other. He strolled over with the unbothered air of a man who had signed off on more reports than he could remember, and fewer than he'd ever truly read. He stopped just long enough to accept the statement Mallory handed him across the desk. With the other hand, he flipped open the cover, let his eyes scan the first few lines, barely grazing the surface, and then scribbled his signature across the bottom in practiced indifference. No questions. No clarifications, just ink and a shrug. Across the room, in the holding area where the pale paint peeled in long strips from the concrete block walls, Bernice Lanier remained exactly as she had been. Upright, composed, hands folded loosely in her lap. She had not asked for food or water, nor had she spoken since being placed there. But now, with a voice that carried neither anger nor urgency, she turned toward the officer watching her from behind the glass partition. "I'd like my phone call, please." The officer glanced up, hesitated, then picked up the landline phone from the desk behind him. He brought it in, placing it on the table in front of her, the receiver still warm from the last use. Bernice took the phone without ceremony and dialed with practiced memory. The number hadn't changed in years. There was no pause on the other end. He picked up on the first ring. "Marcus," she said, and though her voice was soft, there was a note beneath it, steady, controlled, and unmistakably familiar to him. There was a pause as the line responded. She listened, then continued. "It happened again," she said. "This time, worse." Another pause. Her expression didn't change. "Yes," she replied. "I need you to come now." And with that, she hung up the phone and placed it gently back into the cradle. She returned her hands to her lap and waited, not out of hope, not out of fear, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who knew exactly what her son would do. 40 minutes later, the precinct's parking lot trembled faintly as the deep, quiet growl of a black SUV pulled into view. The vehicle rolled to a controlled stop just beyond the department's main entrance, idle for only a breath before the driver's door opened and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out. His movements were calm, deliberate, and devoid of wasted motion. The midday sun glanced off the shoulders of his black suit as he walked up the short concrete ramp with the confidence of someone who didn't need to be announced. Marcus Lanier, director of the DOJ's Federal Oversight Task Force on Police Misconduct, entered the precinct not like a visitor, but like gravity itself, subtle, firm, and impossible to ignore. He crossed the threshold without hesitation, carrying nothing more than a small leather folder in one hand, which he placed, without asking, on the front desk in front of the startled officer seated there. The officer blinked, slowly registering the emblem on the badge that now stared back at him from the polished surface. "Marcus Lanier," the man said, his tone measured but not cold. "Department of Justice. I'm here regarding the arrest of Bernice Lanier." The front desk officer stammered, trying to find the right sequence of words, but before he could respond, Sergeant Murchison stepped into the room with the faintest flicker of irritation across his weathered face. He approached with that familiar blend of small-town authority and practiced bureaucracy. "We've got everything handled here, Agent Lanier," Murchison said, gesturing vaguely toward the hallway. "The report's been filed. She caused a bit of a disturbance. Nothing serious. Refused to show ID, got loud, made a scene. Misunderstanding, really. You know how it is?" Marcus turned to face him directly. He did not smile. He did not blink. He opened the folder slowly and pulled out a copy of the report Mallory had typed, already forwarded through DOJ monitoring systems the moment Bernice made her call. "So, according to your report," Marcus said, "an elderly woman raised her voice in a public diner, resisted arrest, and refused to comply with multiple lawful orders. This, in a place filled with customers, not one of whom was interviewed. No witness statements. No incident logs from bystanders. No reference to video footage, despite the fact that your officers were both equipped with body cameras." Murchison shifted his weight slightly, the lines in his brow deepening. "I haven't seen all the footage yet," he said, though the excuse rang hollow. "That's convenient," Marcus replied, his voice still even, "because I intend to see it now. Full body cam recordings from both officers. I want timestamps. I want the original file structures. And I'd like to speak with Officer Mallory and Officer Reddick separately. I assume your digital evidence locker is on the same subnet as your internal terminals?" Before Murchison could fumble through another answer, Marcus tapped once on his phone. Moments later, the precinct doors opened again with a hiss of rubber on tile. Two figures entered, each carrying the stillness of people accustomed to entering hostile spaces with more authority than invitation. Agent Cecilia Park moved first, her equipment bag slung over one shoulder, dark hair pulled back into a tight braid that didn't move when she walked. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She moved directly toward the evidence processing room without waiting for permission. Agent David Obasanya followed, tall and composed, the kind of man whose mere presence muted conversations. He offered a small nod to Marcus, then surveyed the station with quiet interest before veering off toward the clerk's desk. Marcus turned back to Murchison. "From this moment forward," he said, "no digital files will be altered, deleted, or transferred without my team's knowledge. Agent Park is already imaging your drives, and Agent Obasanya will begin speaking to your front staff." "You're escalating this," Murchison said, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and warning. "This doesn't have to get blown out of proportion." Marcus's expression didn't change. "If it hadn't been proportioned wrongly to begin with," he replied, "I wouldn't be here at all." At the back of the room, Park's voice called out, not loud, but clear. "Agent Lanier," she said, "there's a flagged deletion on Officer Mallory's camera. Timestamp matches the approximate time of arrest. There's a second file from Officer Reddick. Trimmed. I'm recovering both." Obasanya, clipboard in hand, looked up from the front desk staff he'd been interviewing. "There's already a discrepancy between the booking log and the statement given by the arresting officer," he said. "Clerk says she never saw a struggle. She also claims the woman was completely silent when brought in." Marcus nodded once, not out of satisfaction, but confirmation. "Then let's begin." The hum of the precinct's overhead lights seemed louder now, as if the air itself was beginning to notice the shift. What had started as an unremarkable arrest report, signed and filed like so many others, was unraveling, and not with noise or chaos, but with the steady, deliberate hands of people who had made a career of dismantling falsehood. Agent Cecilia Park, silent and precise in her movements, sat at the main evidence terminal with the kind of focus that turned hesitation into failure. Her fingers moved with careful economy across the keyboard, eyes fixed on the directory trees cascading down her monitor. Around her, folders populated one by one, some labeled generically, others with time-stamped codes that suggested manual interference. She didn't comment. She didn't speculate. She simply worked, because facts spoke louder than assumptions, and truth, once recovered, didn't need to be argued. She paused, clicked into a restored file, and let it play across the screen, without adjusting the volume. There was no need. The footage spoke for itself. From Officer Mallory's body cam, the frame showed the inside of Joe's diner. The timestamp confirmed the footage was captured minutes before the moment Bernice had been described in the report as verbally hostile. But the reality was plain. Bernice Lanier, seated calmly at her booth, spoke in a measured voice, her posture composed, her words, though firm, delivered without raised tone or aggression. The officers, however, painted a different picture. Their own voices were louder, more animated. Mallory's approach toward her was swift, his body language tense, and his hand reached for her shoulder with far more force than necessary. The push into the booth, the hard snap of the cuffs, all of it unfolded in silence, save for the clatter of silverware and the hushed gasp of nearby patrons. Park slowed the playback and tilted the screen slightly toward Marcus. "This footage was deleted intentionally," she said, her voice even. "It was not a file error or accidental overwrite. Someone accessed the device, flagged this segment for deletion, and transferred the new file under a false timestamp." She didn't elaborate further. She didn't need to. Across the room, Agent David Obasanya had taken control of the small conference room, its whiteboard and cork panels now covered with printouts and notes. Obasanya, always composed but never passive, stood before a lineup of officers and administrative staff, each seated uncomfortably in front of him. He asked questions with a cadence so calm it disarmed. There were no accusations, no threats, just a steady unveiling of contradiction. One of the desk officers, a younger woman with clipped speech and eyes that kept darting to the hallway, admitted that she hadn't seen Bernice cause any disturbance during booking. She recalled Mallory looking irritated when asked about the file upload. She hadn't thought much of it, until now. Obasanya thanked her, made a note, and moved on. His background as a former civil rights investigator gave him an edge, not through force, but through silence. People talked to him not because he pressured them, but because his stillness reminded them they were already exposed. Just as he began preparing for the next statement, a sharp rattle echoed down the hallway. The front door opened again, and a wave of heat from the parking lot followed a new figure into the station. Chief Arlen Devers stepped in with a look that blended weary familiarity with veiled irritation. His uniform, crisply pressed, was more ceremonial than functional, and the expression on his face was one that had served him well in years past. A practiced calm used to quiet nervous civilians and redirect reporters. He approached Marcus with a slow, deliberate pace, the sort of walk that suggested seniority without inviting scrutiny. "Agent Lanier," he said, extending a hand with calculated ease. "I wasn't expecting DOJ boots on the ground for something so local. Let's get this untangled before we make a mountain out of—" Marcus didn't take the hand. Instead, he gestured toward the monitor, where the recovered body cam footage was now paused on the frame showing Bernice seated peacefully. "Your officers filed a sworn report claiming the subject was hostile, aggressive, and disorderly," Marcus said, his voice composed, but with an unmistakable edge. "The footage we've just recovered shows none of that. In fact, it directly contradicts their written statements. That's no longer a local matter. That's federal." Devers didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed just slightly as he processed the implications, then shifted quickly toward Murchison, who stood frozen near the door, coffee long forgotten. "I'm sure there's some explanation," Devers replied a little too quickly. "Misfiled footage, incomplete reports. Things fall through the cracks. This doesn't have to be an investigation. We can handle this in-house." Marcus didn't smile. You've already had your chance to handle it in-house, and you signed off on a fabricated report. Before Devers could form a rebuttal, a new alert sounded from Park's terminal. She leaned in, clicked, and pulled up a new video, this one from an external source. The camera angle was wider, lower in resolution, but the content was unmistakable. The diner's own security feed. It had captured everything. Bernice's composed demeanor, Mallory's forceful behavior, Reddick standing to the side, uncertain and silent, the way the diners froze, how Joe tried to intervene and was waved off with threats. Every moment of the encounter was recorded from start to finish. Obasanya returned from the hallway with a slip of paper in hand. Local tech team pulled the footage from the diner's back office, he said, offering it to Marcus. Untouched, no edits. Matches body cam timestamps. Confirms discrepancies. At that moment, in the corner of the room where the incident reports were being finalized, Kyle Reddick sat alone at a terminal. He had been staring at the text on the screen for several minutes now, fingers resting above the keys but unmoving. Then, in full view of the monitoring agents and with no attempt at secrecy, he began editing his report. He changed phrases, adjusted times, softened language, removed the term aggressive entirely. It was subtle, but deliberate. Marcus turned his head slightly, watching without speaking. He didn't interrupt, didn't stop the edits, but simply observed, knowing full well that the changes were being logged and screen captured by Agent Park in real time. Guilt never needed to shout. It wrote itself quietly. Marcus stepped away from the desk and walked toward Reddick, who sensed the presence and froze mid-sentence. "Tell me," Marcus said quietly, "what changed between the first report and this one?" Reddick didn't answer. His jaw tightened. His hands slowly lifted off the keyboard. Marcus didn't press further. He simply stepped back and nodded once to Park. Preserve everything. Park already was. The air inside the precinct had changed. It no longer moved with the predictable rhythm of daily operations. Now it hung heavier, more charged, as if the walls themselves had begun listening. What had been just another day, routine paperwork, the usual dismissals, was slowly transforming into something more volatile, more permanent. Officer Kyle Reddick, seated uncomfortably at the administrative terminal, stared blankly at the half-completed edit of his report. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but his mind had already begun to drift from the screen. Sweat gathered at the edge of his brow, not from heat, but from the quiet realization that everything around him was shifting in a way he could no longer control. The lie he had co-signed, the words he had accepted without protest, were now unraveling before his eyes, and the eyes of people who were paid to watch for such unraveling. His throat tightened as he glanced across the room to Officer Trent Mallory, who stood with his arms crossed and his weight shifted to one leg, like a man waiting to be congratulated for standing his ground. Mallory's face, hard as concrete, wore the same half-smirk he'd carried since Bernice had first spoken in that diner booth. He still believed this would blow over, that the thin blue line would hold, that someone higher up, Devers, maybe even Murchison, would step in and wrap the whole mess in procedural jargon until it faded like smoke from an old incident file. His eyes, when they flicked toward Reddick, said exactly that. Stay quiet, stand firm, and this will pass. But Reddick couldn't find that certainty anymore. Not with the footage playing back in full color. Not with Agent Park silently archiving every keystroke. Not with Marcus Lanier standing 20 feet away, quietly watching like a man who already knew how this story ended and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Sergeant Doyle Murchison, who had until now been content to observe from the doorway with his arms loosely folded, shifted on his feet and rubbed at the back of his neck. The tension had finally seeped past the layer of indifference he wore like armor. His name was on that report. His signature, casual and unread, now sat like a fingerprint at the scene of a crime. And as the evidence mounted, the casual ease with which he had dismissed it all began to constrict around him like a rope drawn taut. He took a step forward, lips parting as though to speak, then hesitated. Chief Arlen Devers beat him to it. "All right," Devers said, lifting both hands slightly as if calming a brewing storm. "Everyone take a breath." His voice held the edge of a man accustomed to getting compliance through tone rather than truth. "Let's not spiral this out of control. I think we can agree what we have here is a miscommunication, a situation that maybe could have been handled with more finesse." Marcus turned to him slowly, giving him just enough attention to be polite and not a fraction more. "You want to label it a miscommunication," Marcus said, his voice calm, unwavering. "But that's not what it is. It's a falsified account of an arrest, backed by doctored footage, supported by a signed report, and contradicted by independent video and testimony. What you're describing is negligence. What I'm looking at is misconduct." Devers exhaled through his nose and gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you have a job to do," he said. "But I also know how these things get blown out of proportion when outsiders swoop in without understanding the context." Park didn't turn from her terminal, but her voice, low and sharp, cut through the room. "The footage doesn't require context. It's visual, time-stamped, and backed by digital integrity logs. It tells the story in real time." Marcus nodded slightly, then walked past the front desk toward the hallway leading to one of the side offices. A moment later, he returned holding a printed copy of the diner's seating chart, already annotated with security camera positions and timestamps, courtesy of Agent Obasanya's early walkthrough. "I'd like to speak with Joe Wilkins," Marcus said, "owner of the diner. He's listed here as the one who placed the 911 call when things escalated." No one moved to stop him. Joe Wilkins arrived at the precinct 20 minutes later. He was still in his apron, flour dust clinging to the front of his shirt, and his eyes tired from a day that had veered too far from its usual course. He walked in warily, but not sheepishly. He wasn't a man used to official buildings or government agents, but he had watched a good woman get dragged from his diner in cuffs, and he wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened. In the interview room, Marcus spoke to him with the same level tone he used with everyone. No pressuring, no coaxing, just clarity. "She was polite," Joe said after describing the scene. "Didn't raise her voice, told them they ought to be ashamed of themselves, and maybe they should have been. But that's all. She didn't shout, didn't cause a scene. The only thing she did wrong was not keeping quiet, and I don't think that should count." Marcus nodded. "And when you tried to intervene?" he asked. "They threatened me with a code inspection, said they'd have my place shut down for health violations. I backed off." Joe's hands curled in his lap. "Didn't feel right then. Feels worse now." Marcus thanked him, stood, and walked him out personally. In the hallway, just before letting him return to the front lobby, he paused. "She's not the first they've done this to," Marcus said, "but she might be the last, at least in that building." Joe gave a solemn nod. "She's tougher than she looks," he said. "Always has been." As Joe left, Marcus turned back toward the main room. Reddick was still seated at the terminal, staring at his hands. Mallory stood nearby, jaw tight, arms crossed so firmly they looked glued to his chest. Murchison had disappeared back into his office, the door now closed. Devers lingered near the entry, saying nothing. The building was quiet again, but it was no longer silence born from routine. It was the hush of something shifting underfoot, something real. The air inside the station, once filled with voices and the hum of casual routine, had grown heavy with containment. What had once been a space defined by habit, paperwork stacked by the copier, familiar chatter from dispatch, the clatter of boots on tile, now pulsed with the presence of oversight, scrutiny, and something the officers rarely encountered within their own walls: accountability. Marcus stood near the center of the room, eyes scanning each officer present. Then the hallway that led to evidence processing, then the closed door of Sergeant Murchison's office. His voice, when it came, was calm as ever, but carried a resonance that made conversation stop mid-sentence. "Effective immediately. This facility is under temporary federal lockdown," he said. "All personnel are restricted to the premises until evidence preservation protocols are complete. No files are to be removed, altered, or accessed without DOJ authorization. Phones, personal and department-issued, are to be surrendered to the table outside this room. You may retrieve them once clearance is granted." No one moved right away. It took a beat for the words to land fully, and when they did, it wasn't with noise, but with stillness. An officer near the back of the room shifted uneasily and removed his phone from his belt clip, placing it slowly on the designated table. Others followed, one by one, until the collection of devices lay together like artifacts in a museum, relics of a day that had changed shape entirely. Marcus did not wait for resistance. He already knew the pattern, how it would unfold, who would comply first, who would hold out longest. None of it surprised him. What mattered was that the field was now held. The lock was in place. The narrative would not be rewritten again. In the holding room, Bernice Lanier sat exactly as she had when the officers first placed her there. Her posture had not slouched. Her hands remained loosely folded, resting on her lap. The walls around her were dull and lifeless, a bureaucratic beige that seemed designed to numb thought. But her mind was not here, not entirely. The silence had offered her space, and in that space, memory bloomed. She was 13 the first time she was told to move to the back of a bus. It was summer then, too, hot and humid in the Georgia sun, the kind of heat that stuck to your skin like a second body. She remembered the way the driver had looked at her, impatient, as if she were the inconvenience, and not the sign hung above the rows. Later came the classrooms, segregated, underfunded, where textbooks still bore the scribbled-out names of white students who had used them first. She recalled the metal taste of defiance in her mouth when she asked why her school had no library. No one answered. They just sent her home for the day. She had marched in Birmingham, linked arms in Montgomery, spoken out in church basements and civic halls. She'd been called loud, difficult, ungrateful, dangerous, all for refusing to let people mistake her silence for submission. And now, sitting in this room at 83, she felt not regret, not fatigue, but a familiar steadiness. She had survived more than this, and she had not finished surviving yet. Outside the station, in the world that still turned beyond concrete walls and security cameras, the story had begun to move. Joe Wilkins, though not a man of speeches or confrontation, had never been one to stay quiet when something wrong lingered on his conscience. After leaving the precinct, he paused only long enough to grab a fresh apron and wipe the sweat from his forehead before finding himself facing the two young reporters from the local weekly paper, both barely out of college, but smart enough to know when something serious had cracked the surface of their small town. Joe didn't go on record, not yet, but he said enough. He described what he saw. He described how Bernice had spoken and how the officers had reacted. He described the silence that followed and how his own voice had been stifled with threats of health code violations. He told them not to print his name, but he gave them the truth. And truth, once whispered, rarely stays quiet. By the time the sun began to lower behind the courthouse dome, The first draft of the story had already reached inboxes well beyond the county line. The headline was tentative, respectful, but unmistakable. Local arrest sparks DOJ action. Diner owner speaks on incident. And beneath that, an uncaptioned photo of the diner, the door still slightly ajar. Back inside the station, tension rose in a different way. Mallory, who had remained largely silent since Park's footage was first played back, now approached Reddick, his steps slow, deliberate, and heavy with the kind of authority that came not from rank, but from unspoken debts. His voice, when it broke the silence, carried more venom than volume. "Don't forget who helped you keep that job, man," Mallory said, words like stones underfoot. Reddick, seated once more at the report terminal, didn't immediately respond. His eyes remained fixed on the monitor, though the words on the screen no longer registered. His breath came shallow and uneven. He knew the eyes of the agents were still on him. He knew Park had watched him backspace entire paragraphs. He knew Marcus had watched him hesitate. "I didn't sign up for this," Reddick murmured, his voice hoarse. Mallory leaned in slightly, a sneer forming. "You sure as hell didn't sign up to fold either." There was a long pause before Reddick finally turned his head, just enough to meet Mallory's stare with one of his own. "Maybe we shouldn't have done it." The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. Mallory didn't reply. He stared a moment longer, jaw clenched, then turned and walked away, his boots echoing harder than they needed to across the tile floor. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The weight of what had been done was no longer theoretical. It had become documented, preserved, witnessed. And now, for the first time in years, it threatened to matter. For the first time since her arrest, the door to the holding room eased open without noise or tension. There was no officer behind it, no posturing, no command. Just the silhouette of a tall man whose presence softened only when it crossed the threshold to find the woman sitting alone, exactly as she had been hours earlier. Marcus Lanier stepped inside and closed the door behind him with deliberate care, not wanting it to feel like a cell being locked, but like a pause in the storm outside. He didn't speak at first, and neither did Bernice. Instead, he walked to the edge of the table where she sat, pulled out the opposing chair, and lowered himself into it without ceremony. The distance between them was slight, yet it felt significant, not because of emotional space, but because of what they had both endured separately before this day, and what they now carried together. Bernice studied his face for a moment, longer than he expected. She saw the exhaustion tucked beneath the corners of his eyes, the tension he tried to hide behind formality, the controlled stillness that always lived in his shoulders when he was holding too much. She tilted her head slightly. "You shaved," she said quietly, a faint glint of humor in her voice. "Makes you look even more serious than usual." Marcus allowed a brief smile. Didn't want to give them anything to latch onto. She nodded once, then straightened a little more in her chair. "They didn't hurt me," she said, preempting the question. "Not really. Not like they could have. Not like I've seen." Marcus's gaze dropped to her cuffed wrists, the faint red imprint of metal still visible against her skin. He didn't reach for them. He didn't offer comfort the way someone else might have. He knew his mother well enough to understand that sympathy, even when offered with sincerity, could sometimes feel like pity, and Bernice had no use for pity. "I watched the footage," he said instead. "The diner camera, the body cams. You were calm, direct. They'll never be able to say otherwise." Bernice's eyes held steady. "I wasn't brave. I was just tired." "There's a difference." Marcus leaned back slightly, his elbows resting on the sides of the chair. "You were brave," he said. "Tired can wait." They sat with the silence a little longer, one that was filled not with awkwardness, but with memory. It had been many years since they'd sat together like this, Just the two of them in a quiet room with no meetings to get to, no logistics to run through. And though the space between them was laced with everything unspoken, it wasn't absence. It was history. "I've lived long enough to know when to speak," Bernice said finally, her voice calm, unwavering. "You taught me that." Marcus's eyes lifted to hers. "You taught me first." Her mouth curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something softer, something that belonged only to him. It was a look he remembered from childhood, from quiet Sunday mornings before church, when his tie was always a little crooked, and she straightened it with the same hands that had carried generations. "You always wanted to change the system," she said. "Even when you were small, always arguing with your teachers, always asking why something had to be that way. I didn't think you were listening to me back then." "I was wrong." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, though he said nothing for a moment. Then, in a tone that carried more weight than volume, he replied, "I was always listening. That's why I knew today wasn't a misunderstanding." He reached into the folder on the table, pulling out a printout, highlighted data, redacted names, a chain of altered arrest records. "Cecilia found more," he said, sliding the pages in front of her, but knowing she wouldn't read them. "The arrest logs go back nearly 2 years. Names of people cited for resisting, disturbing the peace, trespassing. All of them either black or Latino. The timestamps have been tampered with, reports modified after signatures, citations issued without booking. Mallory's name appears on most of them." Bernice didn't blink. "And no one stopped him. No one even looked," Marcus said. "Or if they did, they didn't care." Agent Cecilia Park, just outside the holding room, continued working silently. She moved between terminals and storage devices, logging discrepancies with ruthless efficiency. She had already mapped the abuse into a timeline, building a damning portrait of how Mallory's authority had evolved from enforcement to unchecked power. With each log, a pattern emerged: arrests that never resulted in charges, citations that disappeared after court dates were missed, camera footage labeled as technical failure during key incidents. She didn't speak unless necessary, but when she did, her words landed with precision. "The system isn't broken," she had told Obasanya earlier that afternoon, reviewing a folder of compiled incident logs. "It's working exactly as it was built to." Mallory didn't break protocol. He became it. Inside the holding room, Bernice placed her hand flat on the table. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus exhaled slowly, the way a man does when he is not certain, but must lead anyway. "I'll take this to the U.S. Attorney," he said. "If the evidence holds, and it will, there will be an indictment. Park's documentation alone is enough to justify a federal monitor. If Obasanya finishes cross-referencing the logs with internal memos, we'll have grounds to recommend a full investigation into the department." "And the officers?" she asked. "Mallory will be first," Marcus said. "Reddick is already cracking. Murchison signed off on reports he never read. Devers may try to insulate himself, but he's tangled in the same rope. The question is no longer if, they're just fighting to delay when." Bernice leaned forward just slightly, her voice quieter now. "You think this town is ready for what comes next?" Marcus met her eyes without hesitation. "No," he said. "But readiness has never been the reason we speak up." Another long pause settled between them, this one heavier with shared understanding. "I used to think," Bernice said, "that dignity came from being still, from holding your peace and staying calm. But it's not stillness, is it? It's standing." Marcus nodded once. "And sometimes, standing means drawing fire." Bernice looked toward the door, then back to her son. "Then it's good we come from fire," she said. He didn't respond with words this time. He simply reached out, placing his hand gently over hers. The moment was not dramatic. Not performative. It was two warriors of law, mother and son, joined not by obligation, but by a quiet, shared promise. Outside the room, the building held its breath, but inside, something had shifted. Not just between them, but in the weight of what was now unstoppable. The sun had begun its slow descent over the rooftops of the small town, casting long shadows across the sidewalks and turning the precinct's concrete steps into pale slabs of gold. The air outside was no longer just heavy with heat. It carried with it a slow, simmering current of unrest. People were beginning to gather. At first, only a few. Then more. The whisper had become a murmur, and the murmur was taking shape. Inside the building, Chief Arlan Devers stood in his office, the blinds drawn, the air conditioning humming quietly above him. Though it did nothing to settle the tension crawling through his spine. He held the phone tight between his shoulder and cheek, thumbing through the notepad that contained numbers he had once used sparingly, but now clung to like lifelines. His voice was lower than usual, more deliberate, as he explained the situation to someone on the other end. A state-level contact whose tone had shifted from polite to distant. "It's not what it looks like," Devers said, trying to sound calm. "The DOJ's inflating this. Small-town misunderstanding, some questionable filing procedures, and now they're digging like it's a criminal syndicate." He paused, listening, brow furrowed. His free hand traced the edge of the desk. The silence from the other end was longer this time. "No, I didn't know she was his mother. Yes, I've seen the footage. It's not as bad as they're making it out to be. It'll blow over if we give it a few days." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. The pressure was growing too quickly. The timeline was collapsing. The names in those reports, some of them had connections, families who wouldn't stay quiet now that attention had cracked the surface. He ended the call without a clear commitment and stared out the narrow slit between the blinds. Outside, signs were being held in the air. Homemade, angry, focused. Downstairs, Marcus Lanier stood in the center of the station lobby, the same calm presence as before, but now surrounded by the storm of movement. Agents Park and Obasanya working in tandem, reviewing physical documents and interviewing clerical staff, ensuring that the entire infrastructure of the department was being cataloged and archived. Every drawer opened, every file checked, every digital record backed up and secured. Devers appeared a moment later, descending the stairs with a forced composure that barely disguised his urgency. He approached Marcus with a gait that aimed for confidence, but his voice wavered with the strain of containment. "I just got off the phone with the state attorney's liaison," he began, feigning a friendly tone. "They're concerned that this is becoming an unnecessary escalation. You've made your point. Files are being reviewed, protocols assessed. It doesn't have to become something bigger." Marcus turned, his expression unmoved. "Bigger?" he repeated. Devers gestured toward the windows where shadows moved just beyond the glass. "You've got people gathering outside. Press is sniffing around. This town can't survive that kind of spectacle." "This thing's spiraling," Marcus interrupted with the precision of someone not interested in platitudes. "It's not spiraling," he said, voice calm but cold. "It's surfacing. What you're feeling now is consequence. And you don't get to choose how consequences unfold." Devers's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. Across the room, Sergeant Murchison hovered just outside his office, trying to appear useful without drawing attention to himself. His eyes darted between Marcus, Devers, and the various screens set up by the forensic team. The logs, so many of them signed off in his name, were now being connected to a broader pattern. Arrests with no charges. Complaints filed but never logged. Names of citizens who had vanished into paperwork, and never emerged with resolution. Every signature came with a timestamp. Every timestamp with a responsibility. Murchison stepped into the hallway, caught sight of Obasanya entering an interview room with one of the records clerks, and felt a flush of heat rise under his collar. He'd been with the department for 27 years, long enough to know which corners to cut, which voices to ignore, and which officers to protect as long as they brought in numbers. Mallory had always played rough, but he produced results. He filed. He processed. He kept the problems from spilling into the kind of noise that reached city council meetings. Now, all of it was exposed, and Murchison could feel it gathering speed. Outside, the crowd had thickened. It wasn't a mob, not yet, but it had shape. Faces pressed to the edge of the sidewalk, their expressions ranging from grim determination to uncertain curiosity. Cell phones were raised. A local news van had parked just across the street, and a woman with a microphone stood in front of the lens, speaking into the evening air while behind her, signs were slowly rising into view. One of the signs read, "Justice for Bernice." Another said simply, "We saw the footage." At the center of the crowd, Joe Wilkins stood with his arms crossed. He hadn't planned to speak, but when someone asked what he'd seen, he didn't lie. He described the moment Bernice turned in her booth, the calm in her voice, the way Mallory escalated without cause, the way the cuffs looked too tight for her wrists. He told them about the threats, how they'd silenced him before, how he didn't want to be silent now. The story had spread, not just through news outlets, but through back channels, family chats, whispered conversations across dinner tables and phone lines, parents who remembered their own encounters, neighbors who suddenly recalled citations they'd never understood, teenagers who'd stopped speaking after their run-ins, now watching as something finally gave way. Back inside, Marcus stood with his arms crossed as Park approached from the hallway, holding a printout with red-line discrepancies marked along the margins. "There's a second batch of data," she said. "Separate logs hidden under an alias account on the evidence server. They go back even further, beyond Mallory. Arrests never entered into the main system. Footage saved offline. Some of this predates the body cam policy entirely." Marcus reviewed the sheet, expression unreadable. "Keep pulling. This doesn't stop at one man." Park gave a nod and returned to the hallway without further comment. As Marcus looked around the station, at the officers avoiding his gaze, at the stack of files slowly being boxed, at the pressure building just beyond the walls, he understood that this was no longer just about Bernice. This was about the echo behind her silence. The hundreds of names that never made it to paper. The years of unchecked harm wrapped in polite policy. And now, the town was listening. The clatter of printer trays and quiet murmurs of DOJ agents moved through the precinct like the ticking of a slow clock, each moment dragging another truth out of the walls. Outside, the crowd had doubled in size. The chant hadn't started yet, but its rhythm had begun to swell beneath the surface of their voices. Inside, the energy shifted again, as Agent David Obasanya emerged from the records room, his expression marked by the quiet intensity of a man who had just pulled a thread and watched an entire seam begin to unravel. He crossed the lobby with long strides, carrying a slim envelope that had been sealed, filed, and almost forgotten. Its placement so deliberately obscure it might have remained buried had his eye not caught the name on the routing slip. He handed it to Marcus Lanier with no commentary, but Marcus could read the urgency beneath the silence. The envelope bore the DOJ field office stamp. Its return address was blank. Inside was a letter, typed, unsigned, but unmistakably deliberate in tone. The contents laid out a troubling picture. Systemic abuse, false citations, retaliatory arrests, racial profiling, and a clear pattern of officers suppressing or deleting evidence. The language was direct, specific, and laced with insider detail that no civilian could have possibly known. And at the top, the date of submission stood out like a flare. 6 days ago. Marcus reread the opening paragraph. Then again. The wording wasn't angry. It was careful, methodical. Written by someone trying to stay invisible, even while reaching out for help. He looked up. "Who found this?" he asked. Obasanya gestured back toward the filing room. It was routed to the inbox for internal affairs review. Sat there unopened. But whoever wrote it, they were close. New code structures, case handling numbers, citation language. This wasn't written by someone outside the force. Marcus narrowed his eyes. Then someone inside already knew what was coming. Obasanya held up a second sheet, now marked with DOJ metadata, the letter's transmission log. The sender's digital ID had been masked, but not perfectly. The printout included the originating precinct and the terminal. Same computer used to log Officer Reddick's shift notes, Obasanya said evenly. Same time block. That night, he was working late. No other officers logged in. Marcus stared at the paper in his hands. The anonymous letter. The tip that had triggered the field team's attention just days before Bernice's arrest. It hadn't come from outside. It had come from within. And it had come from Reddick. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the lobby until they landed on Reddick, seated again at the same desk where he had hesitated over his report. The younger officer had removed his vest, loosened his collar, but his hands betrayed him, tapping faintly against his leg, twitching like a metronome stuck between panic and resolve. Marcus approached slowly, not out of caution, but to give the moment its full weight. When he stopped in front of Reddick's desk, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand. He simply spoke with the authority of someone who already knew the answer. "You sent it," Marcus said. Reddick looked up, his face pale. He blinked as though the words had struck him physically. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, with a voice raw from silence, he spoke. "I didn't know it'd be her." His throat bobbed as he swallowed, hands tightening into fists. "I swear to God, I didn't know." Marcus said nothing. His expression didn't change. Reddick looked around, then leaned forward, lowering his voice to a tremble. "I was supposed to talk to Internal Affairs. The night it happened. I had a call scheduled, off record, just to say something. About Mallory. About how he'd been running things. I couldn't sleep anymore." His breath caught in his chest as he looked up again, shame tightening his features. "I saw things. Stuff that wasn't in the reports. Stops? That shouldn't have happened. Mallory used to laugh about it, like it was part of the job. And I let it go. I didn't know what else to do." Marcus's jaw shifted slightly, but he still didn't speak. "I never thought they'd drag someone like her," Reddick whispered. "I thought maybe it'd be someone loud, someone who pushed back, someone the department would spin into looking dangerous. Not her." He rubbed his hands over his face, fingers digging into his temples like he was trying to scrub the moment from his memory. She was just sitting there. She didn't even move. And when he pushed her into the booth, I didn't say anything. I just stood there, like always. Now Marcus took a step closer, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "You stood there while he shoved an 83-year-old woman into a booth hard enough to rattle the windows. You stood there while he threatened the man who tried to speak up. You filed a report you knew was a lie. And now you want credit for sending a letter after months, years, of silence?" Reddick didn't lift his head. His shoulders hunched forward, pulled tight by guilt. "I didn't want credit," he murmured. "I just wanted it to stop." Marcus leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice even further. until it was no longer just a reprimand. It was the cold edge of truth cutting straight through the room. You don't get to want peace after standing in silence. You don't get to feel clean because you whispered the truth in secret. Reddick nodded, still trembling. "Then charge me," he said. "I'll sign whatever you put in front of me." Marcus stared at him for a long time. His breath was even. His hands didn't move. "You'll testify," he said at last. "Under oath. You'll give us everything. Names, dates, footage logs. And if you flinch, if you hold back a single detail, I will bury you in the very system you helped protect." Reddick nodded again, the motion jerky but real. "I will." Marcus turned, but before he walked away, he paused once more. "She's not the first you stood by and watched," he said, "but she might be the last." Then he walked away without looking back, and for the first time that day, Reddick wept. The storm had moved from rumor to fact. By the end of the third day, the Department of Justice filed formal notice with the district court, citing sufficient grounds for federal intervention and requesting oversight authority over the precinct pending full investigation. The anonymous tip, now tied directly to a cooperating officer, had rendered all prior defenses irrelevant. The video evidence had already done damage, but the voice from within, that reluctant but pivotal voice, was what stripped the case of ambiguity and made denial impossible. And it was that voice, trembling as it had been, that finally gave Marcus the leverage he needed. The civil suit came next, not as a declaration of revenge, but as a strategic wedge. Filed on behalf of Bernice Lanier, it targeted not only the officers involved, but the department's leadership and oversight structure, naming Chief Devers, Sergeant Murchison, and a list of city administrators whose signatures had rubber-stamped misconduct long before it reached public attention. The suit wasn't just for wrongful arrest. It was for the deliberate maintenance of a culture built on racial targeting, intimidation, and willful neglect. In the motion for discovery, Marcus's team submitted an internal audit conducted by Agent Park. Over 200 pages long, each section meticulously charting the timeline of abuses that had gone unpunished. 2 years of manipulated arrest records had been unearthed. Data cross-referenced from the clerk's logs, patrol schedules, and camera metadata painted a picture that was no longer a pattern, but a policy. Reports were backdated. Body cam footage was selectively deleted. Use of force incidents were documented without incident numbers, allowing them to vanish from searchable databases. At the center of it all stood Officer Trent Mallory, whose name appeared in more than half the flagged files. His involvement ranged from falsified detainment to unauthorized searches and redacted evidence tags, an unmistakable blueprint of a man who had treated his badge as a license, not a responsibility. When the federal indictment landed, Mallory responded not with remorse, but with contempt. His arraignment was held behind closed doors due to public pressure and threats made against the courthouse. His lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney known for protecting officers under scrutiny, opened with a predictable angle, one that twisted the tip into betrayal and Reddick into a scapegoat. The defense argued that Reddick had exaggerated the situation to save himself, that the video footage lacked context, and that Mallory had simply been doing his job under pressure in an increasingly volatile community. But what they hadn't accounted for, what they never could, was the fact that the system they once used to shield themselves now worked for someone else. This time, it worked for Marcus, and Marcus had brought the receipts. Reddick, under agreement from his plea deal, testified under oath and in detail. He described the culture inside the department not as a few bad apples, but as a tree with rotted roots. He admitted to his own failures, his silence, his compliance, and his guilt. But more importantly, he outlined how Mallory had systematically instructed officers to leave things out of reports, to nudge language, to clean files before submission. He recounted a locker room boast about teaching respect to black teenagers and how Mallory would laugh about watching grown men cry when he tightened the screws. The courtroom, though sealed, carried the heat of consequence in every word. The plea deal was formalized on the 5th day. Reddick accepted reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation. He was placed on administrative leave without pay, with final sentencing pending the outcome of his continued involvement. As the investigation deepened, the department's hierarchy began to collapse. Sergeant Doyle Murchison, once a fixture of stability and casual authority, found himself summoned to testify before the Oversight Review Board. He had signed the original report that misrepresented Bernice's arrest. He had approved Mallory's conduct records without cross-checking the use of force logs. And worst of all, he had dismissed multiple citizen complaints without initiating the formal follow-up protocol. When confronted with the footage, presented side by side with his original signature, Murchison's voice faltered. He tried to claim he had been unaware, that the paperwork was fast-tracked and reviewed under pressure, that the errors were administrative, not intentional. But the footage contradicted him. The timestamps didn't lie. Neither did the logs of unanswered complaints, or the videos showing his presence at several post-arrest reviews where he signed off without asking a single question. By the time his testimony ended, Murchison no longer looked like a man defending a system. He looked like a man being swallowed by one. Meanwhile, the precinct itself had begun to crumble. Not physically, but structurally. Morale plummeted. Officers once loyal to Mallory avoided interviews. Several requested transfers. Others called in sick. And for the first time, files that had long been buried in locked drawers found their way to Agent Park's desk, left anonymously, sometimes without labels, as if the department was beginning to purge itself before the DOJ could do it for them. Outside, the protests had evolved. What began as anger now resembled resolve. People no longer shouted just for Bernice. They brought signs bearing other names, names of relatives and neighbors who had stories, quiet ones they had once thought wouldn't matter. But now they did. Every poster, every voice, every camera pointed at the front doors of that station became part of the mounting weight pressing inward. Back in the DOJ command room set up within a cordoned-off conference space, Marcus stood before a whiteboard filled with case timelines, charges, and outcomes. Park briefed him with sharp efficiency. "Federal monitor's been approved," she said. "Oversight will be assigned within a week. The precinct is now under external compliance review. Chief Devers has been placed on administrative hold pending ethics review." Marcus nodded, his expression composed, but the lines around his eyes deeper now. Not from exhaustion, but from resolution. They weren't just winning a case. They were reclaiming something. And it had started, not with a press conference, not with a raid, but with a woman in a diner who refused to be quiet. By the 7th day, the precinct no longer belonged to itself. The familiar routines, coffee breaks in the bullpen, casual jokes behind the front desk, quiet signatures scrawled across daily reports, had been displaced entirely. Every hallway now echoed with the footsteps of federal agents. Walls once covered in community flyers and departmental commendations now bore laminated notices, evidence chain manifests, and legal instructions that were impossible to ignore. A sense of inevitability had taken hold, and in its presence, silence replaced defiance. Chief Arlen Devers stood in what was once his office, the blinds still drawn tight, as if the light itself had turned against him. He paced behind his desk with the same quiet urgency that had served him well through countless crises. Budget cuts, media scrapes, even the occasional scandal that required a fall guy but never reached his name. But this was different. This wasn't an allegation that could be negotiated down to an apology or contained by a memo. This was federal. It was visible. It was personal. The knock on his door didn't surprise him. He turned slowly, exhaling through his nose as Marcus Lanier entered without waiting for permission. Marcus closed the door behind him and stood near it, not crossing the threshold into the room fully, as though the very air in Devers' office was still infected with authority, long since expired. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Devers finally gestured toward the seat across from his desk, a faint smirk on his lips, though his eyes gave away the strain. "You going to tell me I'm finished, Agent Lanier? Or do you want to wait for a judge to do it?" Marcus didn't sit. He didn't smile. "I don't care how it ends for you," he said. "I care how it ends for this department." Devers sighed, dropping heavily into his chair and letting the leather creak beneath him. He looked older now, not from the passing of years, but from the unraveling of the illusion that power was protection. His voice, when it came again, was low and bitter. "You think you fixed something?" he asked. "You think tearing this place apart is justice?" "I think justice is being seen," Marcus said. "And your department made sure people like my mother were invisible until the cuffs came out." Devers shook his head slowly. "You don't understand how it works in towns like this. You think policy solves people. You think oversight heals fear. These officers followed your lead," Marcus interrupted. "They learned how to cut corners from how you ran this building. They learned to ignore truth because you did. You called it maintaining order. I call it cultivating rot." Devers stood then, not in protest, but as if his own weariness wouldn't allow him to sit anymore. "This isn't about me," he said. "It never was." "It always was," Marcus said, his voice low and precise, "because leadership is complicity when it chooses silence. And you chose it every time someone complained, every time Mallory's name came up, every time Murchison skipped protocol, and you let him." Devers opened his mouth as though to deny it, but the energy had drained from his body. He didn't deny. He simply sat back down. When Marcus turned and left the office, there was no satisfaction on his face. Only purpose. Later that day, the public hearing convened at the county courthouse. A long table, polished and cold, stretched beneath rows of bright lights. Microphones hummed softly in front of the officials. DOJ representatives sat at one end, local council members at the other, and between them, divided by nothing more than air, stood the growing fracture between a system that had failed and a town that would no longer accept it. The room was at capacity. Local residents filled every seat, and many stood along the walls, arms crossed, eyes locked forward. The energy was quiet but potent, like the deep breath taken before a crowd erupts, though this crowd had no intention of making noise until it mattered. Bernice Lanier entered through the side, assisted only by a staff escort who offered her a seat near the front. She declined. Instead, she stood quietly by the back wall, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't want the podium. She didn't need the microphone. Her story had already been told in every channel, every paper, every camera angle. Now she wanted to listen. One by one, members of the public rose to speak. A man whose son had been cited twice for failure to comply without ever being charged. A woman who described being stopped outside her own store because she matched a description. A teenager who said nothing, but held up a photo of his brother and left it on the table. Then came Marcus, standing behind the microphone with the same posture he had held since day one. Erect, centered, and utterly composed. "This is not just about one arrest," he said. "This is about a system that incentivized abuse by rewarding silence. It's about officers who didn't just break the law. They rewrote it for themselves. It's about signatures that were supposed to mean oversight, but became rubber stamps. And it's about the lives that were quietly damaged in the shadow of all that. He paused, letting the room hold its breath with him. My mother refused to stay silent. And for that, they tried to make her small. They didn't just arrest her. They erased her dignity, convinced they could walk away from it untouched. But they didn't count on who she raised. And they didn't count on all of you. As he stepped back from the podium, there was no applause, only a silence that felt sacred. By the evening, the Federal Monitor's arrival was confirmed. A new task force had been assigned to oversee not just the precinct, but its training protocols, complaint handling, and officer review board. De Veers had been suspended, pending formal disciplinary proceedings. Murchison, already under deposition, now faced internal referral for dereliction of duty. Mallory's indictment moved to pretrial, and Reddick, out on release under his agreement, awaited sentencing with his cooperation ongoing. But the real shift wasn't in the courtrooms or filings, it was in the town itself. People no longer looked at the precinct as a place that simply enforced the rules. They now saw it as something that could be shaped, reformed, held accountable. What was once a wall now resembled a window, and for the first time in a long while, the people on the outside could see in. The courthouse was hushed, not from formality, but from the weight of what had already been said. Over the course of the trial, the room had become a crucible, burning away excuses, pretense, and layers of departmental rhetoric until only facts remained, raw, undeniable, and damning. The jury had sat through days of testimony that laid bare 2 years of systematic misconduct, a culture built not on justice, but on the confidence that no one would ever look too closely. Now it was time for closing arguments. The courtroom air felt thick with held breath as Marcus Lanier rose from his seat. Dressed in the same dark suit he had worn the day he arrived at the precinct, he walked to the center of the room with the slow precision of someone who understood that silence, when used with care, could be more powerful than a raised voice. He did not begin immediately. He let his presence settle in. He waited for every eye to be on him, not just the jurors, but the spectators, the reporters along the back row, and most of all, the defense team, who had spent the last hour trying to frame the case as procedural failure rather than deliberate harm. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was calm, but not soft. It carried weight, measured, and unyielding. "We are not here because one woman was disrespected," he began, his tone slow and deliberate. "We are here because that disrespect was assumed to be normal. Expected. Ingrained." He let the words breathe, watching them land. "We are here because when Bernice Lanier, an 83-year-old woman who had marched beside legends, who had survived segregation, who had taught in schools that tried to forget her name, when she spoke with dignity in a diner, she was punished for it." Marcus stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. And it wasn't just about that moment. It was about what it represented to the men who arrested her. Her voice wasn't loud. Her tone wasn't violent. Her actions weren't unlawful, but they cuffed her anyway. Because to them, her refusal to be quiet was defiance. And they had built an entire system around the idea that defiance must be broken. He turned toward the jury now, locking eyes with them not as an attorney pleading a case, but as a man asking for acknowledgement of truth. They called it standard procedure. They called it miscommunication. But we have the video. We have the false reports. We have 2 years of manipulated records, all of which share the same pattern. Black citizens disproportionately stopped, cited, silenced. How many voices were lost because they didn't have a son in federal oversight? How many complaints disappeared because someone didn't know where to send them? Marcus's voice grew firmer, though still level. Justice is not simply about punishment. It's about recognition. This court has a choice today, not just to award damages, but to name what happened, to say aloud, for the record, that what was done to Bernice Lanier was not an error. It was an offense, not just against her, but against every person who ever walked past that precinct in fear they could be next. He stepped back. His eyes found Bernice, seated quietly in the first row behind the bar, her posture as straight and composed as it had been in that diner booth. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. He turned back to the jury. I am not asking you to feel sorry for my mother. I am asking you to respect her. And to show that respect by ensuring this doesn't get buried like all the stories that came before it. Then he nodded, walked back to his table and sat. The courtroom remained quiet. Not a whisper, not a cough, just stillness. When the verdict came hours later, the foreperson's voice did not tremble. We find in favor of the plaintiff. Damages awarded, $2.4 million in civil restitution. The judgment was not just financial. It was a message. The courtroom, for the first time, broke into murmurs. Some gasped. Others exhaled, not in triumph, but in release. Bernice closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded, as if acknowledging something more profound than victory. Not vindication, but truth, finally spoken aloud. In the weeks that followed, the dominoes fell with mechanical precision. Trent Mallory, once untouchable inside the blue walls of the precinct, now stood in a federal courtroom. His trial had been swift. With Reddick's cooperation, digital records from Park's team, and hours of documented misconduct, the prosecution left no doubt. He was found guilty on multiple counts: falsification of police reports, civil rights violations under color of law, and evidence tampering. His sentence, 15 years in federal prison, no parole. His attorney, attempting once again to deflect blame toward Reddick and poor departmental training, was met with firm rebuke by the judge. The issue here, the judge had said, is not lack of training. It is the absence of integrity. Sergeant Murchison, who had once signed forms without reading them, was called to testify again, this time before a federal ethics board. Confronted with evidence he could no longer deny, he admitted to negligence, to a culture of willful ignorance. His badge was surrendered. His pension was suspended pending review. Chief Devers, who had fought to control the narrative, found himself erased from it entirely. He resigned in disgrace days before a formal hearing could begin. And the precinct, long the symbol of quiet control and unchecked authority in the town, was officially shuttered under federal order. The building, which had once buzzed with radios and casual indifference, now stood silent, its doors locked, its emblem removed. A new unit was being formed, staffed under federal supervision, its leadership restructured from the ground up. Community oversight was built into its charter. The people who once feared walking into that building were now part of the system that would decide how its replacements would serve. At the heart of it all, Bernice Lanier remained unchanged. She refused interviews, turned down book deals, and asked that her name not be turned into a headline. She went back to her routines: quiet walks in the morning, books at night, the Sunday hat still pressed and clean. She had never asked for attention. She had only asked for decency. And while she did not claim to have won, she knew something far deeper had been lost by those who tried to silence her: their right to do it again. Justice had not come swiftly, but it had come, and that, in the quiet dignity of her heart, was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.